I want you to picture something. A man walks into a room filled with attorneys, buyers, developers, and the most powerful woman in a gated lakefront community. Champagne waits on polished tables. Contracts are organized in perfect stacks. 14 luxury cabin sales are moments away from closing. Millions of dollars are about to change hands. And then, the door opens. Sandra Briggs carried authority like it belonged exclusively to her. Inside Crestwood Shores, she controlled nearly everything. Building approvals, property regulations, community access. People didn't argue with Sandra Briggs. Most people simply learned to stay quiet. That man sits down quietly, places one manila envelope on the table, and waits. No speech, no threats, no anger. Because he has known about this meeting for 11 months. He knew while the foundations were still drying. He knew while the walls were framed and the lakefront decks were installed. He knew while luxury kitchens were assembled, while buyers signed contracts, while inspections were approved. He watched every phase of construction unfold. And through all of it, he never said a word. My grandfather used to tell me something when I was young. The quietest man in the room usually owns it. I didn't understand what he meant back then. I thought power belonged to the loudest person, the one giving orders, the one controlling the room. But silence. Silence becomes dangerous when it belongs to someone patient. While Sandra Briggs was building cabins, I was building a case. Every permit copied, every survey verified, every violation documented. 11 months of silence. Preparing for one conversation. 14 luxury cabins, millions of dollars in pending sales, and one easement they believed nobody would challenge. They were wrong, because before that meeting ended, every single deal in that room was about to collapse. The inheritance nobody wanted. The phone call came on a Tuesday in March. The kind of cold that doesn't feel like winter anymore. It feels personal, like the weather is specifically targeting you. My uncle Derrick had died. Not peacefully. Derrick never did anything peacefully. The man had. Argued with his doctor about the diagnosis. Argued with his pastor about the afterlife. And reportedly spent his final conscious hours debating a hospice nurse about the proper temperature for chicken soup. He was, constitutionally and completely, incapable of letting anything go without putting up a fight. He had been that way his entire life, and death, it turned out, was not going to be the exception. He left me his land. Not money, not the antique pocket watch he'd worn every day for 40 years. Not even the beat-up 1989 Ford pickup I'd always liked. The one with the cracked dashboard and the tape deck that still somehow worked. Just land. A narrow, irregular strip of lakefront property sitting in Millhaven County, 43 miles from the nearest city I recognized, wrapped in pine trees so thick you could lose yourself in them by mid-afternoon, kissed on one edge by a lake. Called Alder that most maps didn't bother to label. The family's reaction was immediate and unanimous. Nobody wanted it. My cousin Brenda, who had been waiting for years to receive something from Derrick's estate, convinced he had secret savings, called it that mosquito patch within approximately 30 seconds of learning the contents of the will. My mother, who had always regarded Derrick's attachment to that property as one of his many inexplicable qualities, called it Derrick's delusion. My brother didn't even bother with a nickname. He just laughed, clapped me on the shoulder, and said, "Good luck with that." The estate attorney was a thin, tired-looking man named Folger, who smelled faintly of old paper and wore shoes that had been resold so many times they looked like geological strata. He described the property as a parcel of moderate assessed value with unresolved boundary questions, and moved on to the next item in the estate before I could ask what unresolved boundary questions meant. I should have pressed him on that. I didn't. Instead, I signed the transfer documents, drove the 43 miles out on. A Thursday afternoon in April, windows down, radio off, thinking about nothing in particular, and turned onto a gravel road that my phone's GPS described as the access route to the property. What I found was not what I had expected. There were trucks, not one or two, a full construction fleet, flatbeds and cement mixers and equipment trailers and pickup trucks with company logos on their doors. There was a freshly graded road that cut right through what I was fairly certain was my tree line, wide enough for 2 lanes, its edges still raw and orange with disturbed earth. And down at the lake's edge, the shore I was now apparently the legal owner of, the land had been cleared, graded flat, and staked with orange survey flags in a pattern that stretched along the waterfront for what had to be 200 yards. 14 concrete foundation pads, some fully poured and cured, some still in forms, each one positioned to face the lake. A man in a yellow hard hat was standing near the closest foundation, talking on a phone and pointing at something. He noticed me standing at the edge of the gravel access road, a stranger in regular clothes, no hard hat, no clipboard, and walked over with the confident, slightly impatient energy of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't resolve in under 60 seconds. "Help you with something?" he asked. "Just looking," I said. He looked at my car, then back at me. "Private development site. You'll want to move along." I looked at the lake. I looked at the 14 foundation pads. I looked at the tree line they'd cut through to make that road. I thought about the deed I'd signed 2 weeks ago. "Nice day," I said. I walked back to my car, got in, and pulled out onto the county road. I drove 3 miles to the nearest gas station, sat in the parking lot, and pulled up the Millhaven County Recorder's Office website on my phone. They closed at 5. It was 4:12 p.m. I made it with 11 minutes to spare. What the deed said? The Millhaven County Recorder's Office was a beige government building that smelled like toner cartridges and institutional carpet cleaner. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency just slightly wrong enough to make you feel vaguely anxious. The county clerk was a woman named Mrs. Patrice Elam. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had the particular manner of someone who has spent 22 years behind a government counter, watching every possible variety of human foolishness walk through the door. She was not unkind. She was simply, efficiently, precisely unshockable. I gave her the parcel number from the deed. She typed it in without asking any follow-up questions and disappeared into the back for approximately 4 minutes. When she returned, she laid 3 documents on the counter in front of me with the calm of a car dealer. The first was the original property survey of my Uncle Derrick's parcel to 4.7 acres in total, running from the county road southward all the way down to the natural waterline of Lake Alder, including 12 feet of shoreline on each lateral edge. The survey was clean, clear, and dated 1974. My uncle's name was on it. Now my name was on the transfer. The second was a shoreline easement agreement, dated September 14, 1987, signed by my Uncle Derrick on one side and the Lakeview Pines Development Company on the other. I read it slowly, twice. The easement granted Lakeview Pines a 6-foot pedestrian access path along the eastern edge of the shoreline, nothing more. It was explicitly, carefully, almost aggressively specific about what was not included. No construction rights. No permanent structures, no grading, no clearing of vegetation, no transfer of any ownership interest of any kind. The language wasn't boilerplate. Someone, probably my uncle, who was exactly the kind of man who read contracts with a highlighter, had made sure that easement was airtight in what it excluded. The third document was the HOA's development permit, approved 18 months ago by the Millhaven County Planning Commission, authorizing the construction of 14 single-family residential units on what the application described as, and I read this part 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly, Lakeview Pines HOA common property. Parcel designation TBD, uncontested. Uncontested, my land, described as theirs. Submitted to a county planning office. Approved without a title search that would have taken about 45 minutes to complete correctly. Mrs. Elam had been watching me read. When I looked up, she adjusted her glasses. Someone filed an incorrect boundary description with the Planning Commission, she said. In exactly the tone of voice someone uses to describe weather that is slightly disappointing, but not particularly surprising. How does something like that happen? I asked. She folded her hands on the counter. In my experience, either intentionally or through a truly remarkable level of incompetence. And in my 22 years here, I have found that those two explanations are not mutually exclusive. I asked for certified copies of all 3 documents. I paid $12. I thanked her. I drove straight home, no stops, no radio, and sat at my kitchen table for about 45 minutes just thinking. Then I called Gloria Marsh. Gloria was a real estate and property attorney who had been recommended to me by my former work colleague, Ray, a man whose judgment I trusted completely because I had once watched him navigate an absolutely impossible contract dispute with the calm of someone defusing a bomb in their living room. He said Gloria was the best property litigator in the region, that she had a mind like a surveyor's instrument, precise, level, impossible to fool, and that she was also, when necessary, completely ruthless. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. I described the site, the construction, the documents, Mrs. Elam's 2-sentence summary of how this had happened. There was a pause on the line, not a long one, maybe 4 seconds. Do not contact them, she said. Do not write to them, call them, show up at the site, or give any indication whatsoever that you are aware of this. Not a single word. For how long? I asked. Until closing day, she said. Let them finish building. Let them list the properties. Let them find buyers. Let the contracts get signed. Let the closings get scheduled. Then we walk in. I understood what she meant immediately. The more they built, the more they sold, the more complete and irreversible the situation became, the stronger my position would be when we finally made ourselves known. Every nail they drove was leverage. Every dollar that changed hands would multiply the weight of that easement deed. Okay, I said. You'll need to be patient, she said. It's probably going to take months. I looked at the certified copies on my kitchen table. I thought about my uncle Derrick, who had spent 30 years saying no to people who wanted that land. I can be patient, I said. The president of everything, her name was Diane Holcroft, and in the world of Lakeview Pines, she was everything. I didn't know her name at first. I just knew there was someone at the top of this operation, someone who had signed those planning documents and pushed the development forward. Finding out who that was took me about 4 days of searching through public records, meeting minutes posted on the HOA's community website, and local newspaper archives that covered the Millhaven County area. Diane Holcroft had been the HOA board president for 9 consecutive years. She had run unopposed for the last 3 elections, not because, no, one had opinions about how the community was managed, but because Diane had a particular talent for making the process of opposing her seem more exhausting than the alternative. She chaired the Beautification Committee, the Covenant Enforcement Committee, and the Welcome Committee. She organized the annual 4th of July barbecue, the holiday lighting contest, and the spring cleanup day. She was photographed at every ribbon cutting, every groundbreaking, every amenity unveiling, by every account I could find. She was the heartbeat of Lakeview Pines. Residents who had lived there for decades described her in terms that hovered somewhere between admiration and mild intimidation. She got things done. She made the community better. She was the reason the gates were maintained and the landscaping was beautiful and the lake access path was kept clear. She was also, according to the development permit application, the person who had signed the document describing my land as HOA property. I found a photograph of her in a local newspaper article from the prior fall, standing at what appeared to be the groundbreaking ceremony for the cabin development, wearing a cream-colored blazer and holding a ceremonial shovel with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. She was smiling the smile of a person who is entirely certain they are right. I printed the article. I put it in a folder. I kept the folder in a drawer. Over the following weeks, I drove past the development on Saturday mornings, never stopping, never turning in, just slowing down enough to observe from the county road. The cabins were going up at an impressive pace, cedar-sided walls, gabled roofs with architectural shingles, small decks on the lake-facing sides, each one angled slightly to optimize the water view. Whoever the architect was, they knew what they were doing. The structures were genuinely beautiful in the way that expensive, well-planned things can be beautiful, precise, intentional, designed with care. I took photographs from the road on every visit, not out of anger, purely for documentation. A dated visual record of construction progress on disputed land can matter in court, and Gloria had told me to document everything. On one of those Saturday mornings, a woman was walking a golden retriever on the path near the entrance to the development. She saw me slowing down, misread it as friendliness, and gave me a cheerful wave. I waved back automatically. I wondered if she had already bought one of the cabins. I felt something uncomfortable settle into my chest, a weight I didn't have a clean word for, not guilt exactly, not quite regret, something more like the awareness of consequences that haven't arrived yet. But then I thought about the planning application. The words HOA, common property, uncontested, the name signed at the bottom. I drove home. I let the weight settle where it was, and I waited. 11 months of silence. People who hear this story always ask me the same question. How did you stay quiet for so long? The honest answer is that silence is much easier when you understand what it's doing for you. I wasn't passive. I wasn't resigned. I was strategic. And strategy, once you can see the whole shape of it, carries its own kind of calm. Gloria was working constantly behind the scenes. She had pulled every related document from the county, survey records, planning commission minutes, the HOA's formation documents, deed histories going back 40 years. She was building a legal architecture that would be airtight when the time came. We spoke every 2 weeks. She updated me on filings, on research, on what she was preparing, and each update made the eventual outcome clearer and more certain. What was genuinely difficult was watching the marketing. In June, the HOA hired a regional real estate brokerage to market the 14 completed cabins. The listings appeared on all the major platforms simultaneously: professional photography, drone footage of the lake, virtual tours. The headline on every listing was "Exclusive Lakeview Pines Lakefront Retreat, Clear Title, HOA Managed Community, Move-in Ready." Clear title. The prices ranged from $340,000 for the units farthest from the prime shoreline position to $480,000 for the 3 best Lakeview lots. Within 60 days, 11 of the 14 were under contract. I watched buyers schedule home inspections. I watched them arrange financing. I watched disclosure forms get signed, earnest money deposits get made, closing dates get penciled in. The real estate machine was moving forward with the enormous, self-assured momentum of a process that had no idea what was waiting at the end of it. I knew about some of the buyers' second-hand things Gloria picked up through public record research and court filing review. A retired couple from Columbus who had dreamed of a lakefront place for years. A family from Cincinnati buying it as a vacation investment. A man in his early 40s who intended to live there full-time and work remotely. These were real people with real plans built on a transaction that was going to collapse. That was the weight I kept carrying. But every time I felt it pressing down, I went back to the planning application, to the words HOI, common property, uncontested, to the fact that a title search, the most basic, routine step in any real estate transaction, would have caught this immediately if anyone had done one properly at the permit stage. To the fact that Diane Holcroft, who had managed this community for 9 years and understood property documentation, had signed that document. Gloria had also taken one significant legal step during those 11 months. She quietly filed a corrected boundary record with the county, formally documenting the disputed ownership and attaching the 1987 easement. Then she notified the title insurance companies, not the HOA, not the buyers, just the insurers, that a boundary dispute existed on those parcels and that any title insurance policy issued on those properties should be flagged pending resolution. The title companies flagged the closings, and then, apparently operating on the assumption that all title flags resolve themselves without anyone having to do anything, they scheduled the closings anyway. This flag did not resolve itself. It had a name on it. It had a deed behind it. It had an attorney who had been preparing for 11 months. It was waiting. The closing was scheduled for a Wednesday in February, 9 months, 3 weeks and 4 days after I had stood at the gravel road watching men pour concrete on my land. It was held at the offices of Millhaven Title and Escrow, a suite on the second floor of a beige office park near the county line. The meeting room was large. They had needed the space. Multiple closings were scheduled for the same day, coordinated as a single event, which was itself a reflection of how confident everyone involved was that this was going to go smoothly. There were refreshments. There was, I was told later, a bottle of champagne in a small cooler near the credenza. Diane Holcroft was there in a blazer the color of deep water, sitting at the head of the table with the composure of a person who has presided over dozens of successful outcomes. The real estate broker, Curtis Webb, was there. A polished man in his mid-50s who wore expensive shoes and had the practiced warmth of someone whose income depends entirely on rooms, full of people feeling comfortable. There were buyers with their attorneys. There were lenders. There were title company representatives. There was a notary. I arrived with Gloria and one manila envelope. We were early. We took seats near the middle of the table. Nobody knew who we were. People glanced at us with the polite, slightly questioning look that strangers get in rooms full of people who know each other, and then went back to their conversations. When the meeting was called to order and introductions were made around the table, Curtis Webb reached us and looked at me with a professionally pleasant smile. "And you are?" he asked. "The landowner," I said. The room didn't go silent immediately. It took a half-second, the delay of a sentence that doesn't parse correctly the first time. Then it went very quiet. Diane Holcroft's head turned toward me. Slowly, deliberately, with the careful movement of someone who has just heard a sound they cannot immediately place. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, experienced. "Which landowner?" Gloria opened the manila envelope. She placed 3 documents on the table: the 1974 survey, the 1987 easement, and the corrected county boundary record with its official stamp and filing date, and she slid them to the center of the table with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows exactly what each paper contains. The foundations, structures, and all improvements constructed on Parcel 44B of the Millhaven County Shoreline Survey, she said, in a voice that was clear and pleasant and completely without drama, were built on land titled to my client. The 1987 easement agreement grants pedestrian access across a 6-foot shoreline path only. No construction rights were included. No ownership interest was conveyed. The planning application, submitted 18 months ago contained a material misrepresentation of the parcel's ownership status. The county boundary record has been corrected and is on file as of 4 months ago. Curtis Webb picked up the survey. His fingers were not quite steady. Diane Holcroft was reading the easement document. She had gone completely still, the stillness of a person watching a structure they have. Bilt began to list to one side. Her face was the face of someone who has just realized, with absolute clarity, exactly how wrong they are and exactly how far they have gotten on the basis of being wrong. One of the buyers, a man in his early 60s, his wife beside him, both of them sitting with the slightly dazed look of people who drove 2 hours for a celebration and have just encountered something they don't have a category for, looked across the table. "What does this mean?" he said, very quietly, the voice of someone who already suspects the answer. The notary had put her pen down. Nobody touched the champagne. The law does not have much patience for ambiguity when the facts are clear. There is a legal doctrine called accession. In simple terms, it holds that when someone builds a permanent structure on land they do not own and cannot claim ownership of through any documented agreement, that structure belongs to the landowner, not the builder, not the investor, not the HOA, the person whose name is on the deed. 14 cedar-sided, fully constructed, professionally photographed, actively marketed lakefront cabins. Legally, as of the moment Gloria laid those documents on the table, mine. The title insurance companies froze all closings within the hour. Not because someone asked them to, because their own flagged records had now been formally invoked with documentation they could not ignore. The underwriters were on the phone before the meeting had technically ended. The buyers, understandably, went home and immediately called their own attorneys, every single one of them, within 72 hours. 11 sets of attorneys had reviewed the documentation and reached the same conclusion. The HOA's title was not clear. The sellers had represented otherwise. The buyers had a range of options, none of which involved their original closings proceeding as planned. Gloria filed suit in Millhaven County Circuit Court within the week. The complaint laid out the full chain: the boundary misrepresentation on the planning application, the construction without authorization, the marketing of properties with fraudulent title representations, the collection of earnest money deposits from buyers based on those representations. That last element, the collection of money from buyers based on a false title claim, was what elevated the situation from a civil property dispute, something that made the county prosecutor's office sit up and take notice. Diane Holcroft hired a defense attorney named Philip Carver, who had a reputation for aggressive pretrial maneuvering. His first move was to argue survey error, that the original 1974 boundary description was ambiguous and could support multiple interpretations. When Gloria produced the full chain of recorded surveys dating back to 1952, all of which placed the parcel boundaries identically, that argument dissolved. Carver's second move was to argue that my uncle Derrick had verbally agreed, sometime before his death, to expand the scope of the easement to include construction rights. When asked to produce any evidence of this, any written record, any witness, any correspondence, he had nothing. My uncle had said no to these people for 30 years. He had never said yes in any form that left a trace. After that, Carver went quiet. The HOA board held an emergency session approximately 3 weeks after the closing day meeting. The vote to remove Diane Holcroft as president was, by all accounts, swift and overwhelming. She submitted her written resignation before they could act on the vote, which meant, in the end, she got to say she resigned rather than being removed. It was the last small control she had over how the story would be told. Among the 11 buyers, 4 chose to settle directly with me, releasing their contracts with the HOA, recovering their deposits through the insurance claim. and in one case, negotiating a fair market lease arrangement that let them use a cabin through the following year while the legal situation resolved. 3 others pursued their claims through the title insurance process and received full refunds of their deposits, plus documented costs. The remaining 4 became co-plaintiffs in a separate action against the HOA itself, seeking damages for misrepresentation. The HOA's liability insurer negotiated a settlement with me that covered both the unlawful construction costs and a land use damages figure that Gloria had carefully calculated based on the fair market value of the shoreline property and the revenue generated by the cabin sales. What did I end up with? The land, the corrected deed, the settlement payment, and 14 fully constructed, beautifully built lakefront cabins legally transferred to me by operation of law, sitting on the shoreline of Lake Alder on a 4.7-acre parcel in Millhaven County that my uncle Derrick had spent 30 years refusing to give away. My grandfather would have said, "The quietest man in the room usually owns it." He would have been right. 2 months after the settlement finalized, I drove out to Millhaven County one last time to collect the remaining items from a small storage unit my uncle Derrick had rented near the property. It was a Saturday morning in early May, the kind of morning that feels like an apology for winter, soft air. Thin clouds, the smell of pine and turned earth coming off the tree line. The lake was flat and pale gold in the early light. I could see the cabins from the access road. 14 of them, quiet and cedar warm, their decks catching the morning sun. They were beautiful. I kept coming back to that. Whatever else you could say about the Haston OA, and about Diane Holcroft, and about the entire chain of decisions that had led to the closing day meeting, the architect had done extraordinary work. The cabins belonged to the landscape. They looked like they had always been there. The storage unit was a 10 by 10 climate-controlled space that smelled of old cardboard, and the cedar chips my uncle had apparently scattered across the floor at some point in the last decade. Most of what was inside was unremarkable. Tools, a folded tarp, 2 plastic chairs, a box of fishing equipment, a collection of seed catalogs from the late 1990s that I could not explain. In the back corner, under a broken transistor radio and a stack of Reader's Digest magazines from 1993 and 1994, was a shoebox with no label. Inside the shoebox was a rubber band, 2 expired fishing licenses, a photograph of the lake from what looked like the 1980s, a small pocket Bible that had been so thoroughly annotated in the margins that you could barely read the original text, and a letter. The letter was handwritten on 3 sheets of plain white paper, folded in thirds, held with a single paperclip. It was dated 6 years ago. The handwriting was my uncle's, cramped and slanted, and moving across the page in the impatient manner of a man who always had somewhere else to be. There was no addressee, just a date at the top and then this. If you are reading this, you probably got the land. I know it. Doesn't look like much. I know Brenda is calling it a mosquito patch. She can think what she wants. They have been trying to get that shoreline from me for 20 years. The development company first, then the HOA that replaced it. They have sent letters. They have sent representatives. They have had lawyers call. I have said no every single time. I will not be selling, and I will not be signing anything that gives them more than I already gave them in 1987, which is a walking path and nothing else. That shoreline is worth more than they will ever tell you. Get the deed. Get the 1987 easement papers. Read them carefully. If they have done what I suspect they have been planning to do for years, those 2 documents are all you need. Keep your mouth shut until you know exactly what you have. Don't react. Don't threaten. Don't give them the chance to adjust. Let them go as far as they are going to go. Then use what you have. The quiet ones win. I love you. Don't let them have it. I sat down on one of the plastic chairs in the storage unit and read the letter 3 times. My uncle Derrick had known. He had spent 20 years saying no to the HOA and their predecessors, and everyone else who had ever looked at that shoreline and wanted it. He had held it with the tenacity of a man who understood that what something is worth and what it looks like are almost never the same thing. He had written a letter, to no one specific, to whoever ended up with the deed, to the idea of a person who might need to. No, and he had put it in a shoebox under a broken radio, and he had trusted that it would be found when it was supposed to be found. He never got to see how it ended, but he had known how it could end if the right person played it right. I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the shoebox, and carried it to my car. Then I walked down to the lake. I stood at the waterline, my waterline, on my 4.7 acres, on the shore of Lake Alder, and watched the morning light move across the water. The 14 cabins stood behind me in a quiet row, their decks facing the same direction I was facing. The pine trees at the edges of the property made the light come through in columns. It was, genuinely and without any irony, one of the most beautiful pieces of land I had ever stood on. They had built it for themselves. They had cleared it and graded it and constructed 14 beautiful structures on it and marketed it and very nearly sold it. All on land they had never owned and had never had any right to develop. They had thought silence meant no one was watching. They had thought silence meant absence. It never does.